Hi, welcome to part 2 of the Entity Framework series. In this video, I'll show you how to configure a .NET application to connect and interact with a database using Entity Framework. The Entity Framework API provides the dbcontext class, which is the primary class that is responsible for interacting with the database. Typically, we use the dbcontext class by creating a class that inherits from the dbcontext class. We then simply extend the derived class. This way, we can define our own custom configurations in the derived class. There are a number of workflows when it comes to initializing a database in Entity Framework. In this tutorial, we will use the code-first workflow, which means we start by creating the entity classes. Then Entity Framework uses a set of rules and conventions to create a database and add tables based on the entity classes we define. Entity classes are simply classes that represent objects to be stored in the database. An example would be the customer class, products class, etc. They may contain properties like name, address, phone number, and the like. So with that being said, let's go to Visual Studio and get to the coding. Here in Visual Studio, I have a console application project set up, and I'll be going through the process of configuring Entity Framework to enable this application to connect and interact with an SQL database. I'll start by adding a NuGet package to the project. So I'll right-click on the project and select Manage NuGet Packages. Here in the Browse tab, I'm going to search for Entity Framework. For this project, I'm going to add the Entity Framework package. So I'll go ahead and install this package. Great, so the package was installed successfully. So I'll go ahead and close this tab. Now here in the program.cs file, we have the typical console application logic. So I'll get rid of this line of code. Now we know that Entity Framework uses the dbcontext class to establish a connection between the application and the database. I'll be creating a class that inherits from the dbcontext class. To do that, I'm going to add in a namespace. So I'm going to say using system data entity. The dbcontext class and other classes related to Entity Framework are defined in this namespace. For now, this is the namespace I'll be using. Now here, I'm going to define a class, and I'll name this class data context. It's going to derive from the dbcontext class. And I'm also going to define a constructor within the class. Now we understand that when dealing with data in a database, we deal with that data in form of entities, which means when we want to store data, for example, we want to store a customer, a product, or an employee. That data will be stored in form of rows, and each row is going to have specific fields. For example, you would have the name field, address field, ID field, etc. So Entity Framework will work with entity classes to be able to define the types of entities that will be stored in the database. So I'm going to create a class that will define an entity. So in this case, I'm going to create the user entity. And the fields are going to be represented by the properties that will be defined on this class. So I'm going to define a property, which is the ID. So I'll say user ID. And I'll define another property, which will be the name property. And lastly, I'm going to define the address property. Now here in the dbcontext class that I created, I'm going to specify certain configurations for the model that we're going to be using to communicate with the database. Now to do that, I'll simply add a property of the type dbset. This property type is also defined in the system's data entity namespace, and it's a generic, so it simply allows us to specify the entity type, basically the type that will be stored in a database. So in this case, I'll specify the user type. Then for the name, I'm just going to give it a name users. So entity framework is going to use what we define here to create a database and also create tables based on what we define. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to try to attempt to read data from the database. So I'll create an instance of the data context class. So I'll simply say data context. Now, to ensure that once this object is used, that we dispose of it, I'll simply add the using statement. So this ensures once it's out of scope, it's no longer in use, the garbage collector will get rid of the resources attached to the object. So what I'm going to do is I'll now use this context object to query data from the database. So I'll simply specify the property that we defined on the data context class. So I'll say users. So this would relate to the users table, which stores objects of the type user. Now here we can see we have a number of methods that we can use to query data and process data. In this case, I'm just going to call the toList method. So this will basically query all the users stored in the users table and return them in form of a list. Now I'll store this inside a variable. So I'll just say my users. So once we query that data, I'm going to write to the console. So I'm going to write to the console saying done reading. Now to prevent the application from shutting down, I'm going to call the console.read method. Now let's quickly go through the code to clearly understand what's going on. I have a class of the type user specified here, and this class represents the entity that will be stored in the database. Now here I have another class of the type data context that inherits from the dbcontext class. So this class will be responsible for connecting the application to the database. Now within this class, I have specified a property of the type dbset. Now this represents a collection of objects of the type user. Now by me specifying this property, I'm actually configuring this data context class to map this property to a table in the database that stores the user entity. Here in the main method, I'm attempting to read data from the users table. Now I'll go ahead and run the application and observe the results. Now one thing to note is that I haven't specified the connection string anywhere. So how is it possible that the application will now find the database and attempt to read data from the database? Well, it's because we're using code-first approach. Now we understand that Entity Framework has got a set of rules, and it uses those rules to actually assume or predict what we are trying to do. So in this case, if we do not specify the connection string, Entity Framework will assume that we are trying to connect to LocalDB, and it's going to actually create a database in the LocalDB. So here, let's go ahead and run the application. All right, so here the application executed successfully. So I'll go ahead and close this. Now notice we do not have any exceptions. Now I can actually examine the local DB server and see the results. So right here within Visual Studio, I'll go to View, then I'll select SQL Object Explorer. Now here we have local DB. So I'm going to refresh this and open up. Now notice under databases, we have a new database of the type app.config data context. Notice the name of this database. The name of this database is the name of our namespace and the data context class. So here we have the namespace and the data context class. Remember I mentioned that Entity Framework has got a set of rules. So if you do not specify the connection string, Entity Framework has no way of knowing the name of the database. So it's going to get the namespace and the name of your class, and it's going to create a database and create that name. Let's examine further this database. So right here, let's expand the tables. Notice we have a table of the type users. So how did it create this users table? Well, we specified here a property of the type dbset, and we specified the class. Now, Entity Framework is going to get the name of this class and is going to get the plural. So based on the English rules, it's going to create the plural of this, and we know that the plural of user is actually users. Now, Entity Framework doesn't get the name of the property. It gets the name of the class and creates the plural. Okay. Now let's expand this table. And here under the columns, let's expand that as well. Now we have the columns and we have user ID, name, and address. Notice that the user ID is a primary key. So how does that happen? Well, Entity Framework rules. Here, whenever we create a property and we name that property the name of the class and we add ID, Entity Framework is going to assume that we are trying to create that property as the key, basically as the primary key. So based on those rules, Entity Framework will simply check, oh, you named it user ID, so this should be the ID. So Entity Framework has got a number of rules that it follows if you don't explicitly specify. Now, what we can do is we can try to modify a bunch of things here to see the results. So I'll go ahead and delete this database. Now here, I'm going to name this class person. So I'll go ahead and run the application. Now we attempted to run the application and we noticed that we have an exception. So basically, it's simply saying that we do not have a key specified on this class. So let's go ahead and close this. Now the reason for that is because Entity Framework was trying to apply its rules, and it was simply looking for a property that has the name of the class and ID. So in this case, we left this named user. So it simply said this is not the key of this entity. So by simply changing that to person ID, which is the name of the class, then ID, let's attempt to run this application again. Great. Now this time the application executed successfully. So I'll go ahead and close this. And here, let's examine the database again. So I'll simply refresh. Now notice this time we have a table named people. So basically Entity Framework took the word person and created the plural, which is people. And if I expand this, the columns, we notice that person ID is the primary key again. So based on these rules, Entity Framework is able to configure the database. Now, let's say we do not like the current name of the database. So how can we change that? So what I'll do is I'll get rid of this database. Okay, so here what I'm going to attempt to do is to change this constructor here. Now remember, if we modify the dbcontext, which is our data context class here, we are simply also modifying how Entity Framework will configure the database. So here what I'm going to do is I'm now going to modify the constructor. The constructor will now take in a string, and I'll name this string name. And once I pass a string to the constructor, I'm going to pass that string to the class that we inherited from. So I'll say base. So the dbContext class that we inherited from has got a constructor that takes in a string, and that string is the string that will be used to name the database. So here, by modifying my constructor, I'll pass that string to the class I inherited from. Now here we can see the warning here. So what I'll simply do is I'll specify a string, and I'll just say Jamie. Now I'm going to attempt to run the application. Alright, so the application ran successfully once more. So I'll close this and I'll examine the database. I'll refresh. Notice this time our database is named Jamie. Why? Because we modified the data context class. So to conclude, whatever you do to the data context class is how your database will look like. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you how to now configure this data context based on a connection string. So I'll get rid of this name here, and I'll also change the constructor back to the way it was. So one way of actually configuring your data context class to connect to a connection string is by actually adding an app.config file to your project. So right here, I'll just click on add, new item. Then here under C# items, I'm going to select application configuration file. So this is simply app.config. Now don't rename this, leave it the way it is. Alright, so we have the configuration file set up. So I'm going to add a connection string to this configuration file. So I'll say connection strings, then add. So I'm going to specify a name. Now the name of our connection string should be the same name as our data context class. So in this case, I'll say data context. Then here I'm going to specify a connection string. Now for me to specify this connection string, I'll get it from here. So I'll say local db. Then under the properties panel here, I'll get the connection string right here. So I'll copy. And then I'll paste. So I'm going to get rid of some unnecessary data that's defined here. So here, the initial catalog is actually the name of the database. So I'm just going to give the name my new database. And I'm now going to specify the provider. So the provider name is system.data SQL client. Now let's go to the program.cs file here. So here, if I say using system data, then SQL client. So basically, Entity Framework actually calls this client, SQL client, when attempting to communicate with the database. So in the connection string here, I need to specify the provider. So I say provider name is just the name of the namespace, so which is SQL client. Okay, so but I'll get rid of it here. So that's how we specify our connection string. Now I'll go back to the program here. So here I don't specify the name and the connection string. Then here I'll delete this database, and I'll now attempt to run the application. Alright, so the application ran successfully. So I'll close this and I'll examine. So I'll refresh. Now notice this time the database name is my new database. So Entity Framework will start by checking if you specify the database name. If you don't have a database name or data connection string specified, it's going to check for the connection string in the application.config file. So that's one way of actually configuring your application to communicate with the database. Now I'll go ahead and minimize this. Now there's another way that we can configure a connection string using the same app.config file. So let's go here. Suppose we have a different connection string. So I'll copy and paste. And let's say this time we say app connection string. Right? So we name it app connection string. Then the database name is app database. So how can we specify that we want to actually use this connection string? So I'll go back to the program.cs file. Now I'm going to modify our data context class. So here I'm going to say it'll take in a parameter of the type string. Then I'll just say name, then call the base and pass it that name. Now here, what I'm going to do is I'm now going to specify that I want to use a specific connection string. So what I'll do is I'll get the name that I specified here. Now this time I won't just paste it as a plain text. So I'm kind of going to use name, then I'll say is equal to, then the name of the connection string. So by saying name is equals to the name of the connection string, I'm basically allowing Entity Framework to phase this string, and Entity Framework is going to understand this string differently from the way it would understand if I just wrote plainly like that. So you have to specify the credential here, saying the name is equal to the name of the string. So let's go ahead and run the application. All right, so we see the application ran successfully. So I'll go ahead and close this. Now here I'll examine, so I'll refresh. Notice that under database, we now have a new database called app database. So I actually specified that I would want to use a different connection string by simply specifying this string here. So that's one way of actually connecting to the database, by specifying a connection string. Now in the next video, I'm going to talk about how we can configure different entities and how that we can manipulate the default behavior of Entity Framework. So stay tuned for the next video. For now, I'll see you in the next one.